Hi, everyone. My name is Asia Salastino. Welcome to this Facebook Gold Talks panel presented by Gold House. It is Filipino American History Month, so we have a jam-packed panel of amazing individuals to join us today talking about Filipino heritage and contributions. And I'm going to go ahead and introduce them. We have supermodel, TED speaker, advocate, and now director, Gina Rosero, Emmy-winning writer, director, and animator, Joe Mateo, and publisher, writer, and artist, Gail Romasanta. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you for having us. So excited
Yeah.
to be here.
Of course. So I'm going to go round robin and talk a little bit about all of your individual projects because you're all doing really amazing things, driving representation and moving our community forward. So talking about your individual projects, but also delving into Filipino American History Month. I want to start with Gina. You have a documentary called Caretakers, highlighting Filipino American medical workers throughout history, and also especially how they've been on the front lines during this pandemic. I think it's so important. Tell me how you became involved with this project. It is your directorial debut. Congratulations.
Thank you. Salamat, salamat. First of all, what a way for this to be my first directorial debut. But certainly when we first put together the deck, the project, when we first started talking to PBS, I was not the director. I presented as a project. I have been producing so many projects for many, many years. But I think we had this project since last year, since obviously the devastation that we were experiencing. But at the same time, I have so many lists of potential profiles and people in the front lines that I wanted to feature. So I've gotten really familiar to their subject and their lives. I'm constantly in conversation with them. And I think when we got to the point when we are about to shoot, we were like, you know what? I knew I wanted to direct, but I didn't know that this was going to be a first. But because I've gotten so familiar with them, I just said, this is the time, and what perfect way to do that, to be the director and in a way be the one in charge of all layers, right, of storytelling. Joe, you know this, but in that process of not just my experience of being a fashion model, being in front of the camera and feeling like I'm not in control of the story, and what better way to do this than be a director. And I think for me personally, I wanted to start with some people that I've known in the community. And I also wanted to highlight and specifically present this profile of Filipino Americans, not just in medical field, but also different types of care workers. The project is called Caretakers, and really expanding that definition and really show the fullness of our lives. The first episode that launched on October 8th is this woman named Belinda Ellis, the lead emergency nurse at the epicenter of COVID here in New York at Elmer's Hospital. But we also got to show her background, her history of being born and raised in the Philippines. First job out of the Philippines is during the Iran-Iraq War. And first time getting to the United States was working at at Bellevue Hospital during the height of AIDS pandemic, and experiencing this pandemic. But also at the same time, this woman just wants to dance after a 12-hour shift. So I wanted to show that full lives, and it's I can't wait to show the other 3 episodes.
Absolutely. It sounds like a really powerful story that you're putting together and can't wait to view it. I do want to switch gears to Joe. You have an animated short film on Apple TV Plus called Blush. It's not only a love letter to your personal love story and your wife, it's also a tribute to your Filipino heritage. Wondering if you could share just a little bit more about the project.
Yeah, so kind of like Gina, this is my first time to direct something, and I never really imagined myself uh, being a director, but I feel like this is a story worth telling. So Blush is inspired by something very personal that happened to me like 4.5 years ago. I lost my wife from breast cancer, and I experienced that, that same night I couldn't breathe. Like I didn't know what was happening to me. It was really scary, right? And I had to call like a friend of ours who's a doctor to let me know that I'm having a panic attack. It's like, oh, that's a panic attack. I've heard that before, but it was my first time experiencing it. And fortunately for me, my kids were there next to me. Um, that they helped me through it. My girls. Um, and after several months, I kind of struggled to go back to work. I tried, and I remember thinking it would be a good distraction, right, to go back to work. But no, I struggled, and then I kept looking back to that moment and to where I was like struggling to breathe. And I realized that Marianne was my heir, and my daughters saved me. My two daughters saved me, Joanne and Mina. And it just inspired me to share with people that losing a loved one can be overcome by surrounding yourself with people you love. It's very Filipino. It's family, orientation and all that. And yeah, that kind of made me, I started forming the story. I started thinking about it and where I can set it. And it just kind of naturally helped me get back into what I do, which is storyboard. During that, I was still at Disney doing storyboarding. So it was very therapeutic for me. And then, yeah. And when I kind of not fully formed, but when I was like, got to the point where, oh, this is something that I'm ready to pitch to someone, but I wasn't sure where to do it, because of the nature of it just being so personal. And Fortunately for me, I found Skydance, who's it's an amazing studio, and they know how personal the story is, and they didn't want to change it. They just want to tell it, purely in my personal POV, basically. So
Thank you so much for sharing that, Joe. Trying to get us to cry in like the first 2 minutes of this interview. But
I'm
it's
so sorry.
really, no, it's really beautiful. And thank you for sharing that with us and telling us about how you turned something that was a tragedy in your life to something that is really transformational for the Filipinx community. I do want to come back to you, but last but not least, Gail, you're working on Larry the Musical. It's about the life of a Filipino American labor leader, Larry Itliong, which I think so many people in the US, he is so tied to American history, but many may not know of him. Tell us more about the musical and his life.
So the musical was really kind of a joint effort between San Francisco Bay Area artists, Broadway folks, Filipino American Broadway folks, and veterans who've been there, and also we have a few LA artists on board with us. But it's about Larry Itliong, and I've been working with the story of Larry Itliong for a little bit now, and the historian, Dr. Don Mabalon. We had written together a book called Journey for Justice, The Life of Larry Itliong. And it's a children's book, but it's actually taught at colleges and universities throughout the United States. And it's actually used here in California at, school districts so that folks and students, their caregivers and their families know about Larry Itliong. And we turned it into a musical just because my collaborators and I, Melvin Barriola and Brian Pangalina, and we've all been in theater together. And also I'm a musician, and I thought, I want to work in music again. So it was a perfect project. But Larry Itliong was a great labor leader, and he was not ever really talked about or written about at all. So Journey for Justice is the first book about him, and he actually led the Filipinos to strike. They began the Great Delano Grape Strike, the Great Delano Grape Strike in 1965, and within a year the UFW was created. It was Larry who called Cesar Chavez. He was friends with Dolores Huerta and said, "Hey, Filipinos and Mexicans, we need to come together in solidarity." And so a mostly Filipino union came together with the association, a mostly Mexican association of farm workers came together, and with a diverse group of folks created the United Farm Workers. And for so long in our community, it's almost been like a secret because no one really knows, like, oh, Filipinos started the Great Delano Grape Strike. Oh, we were part of the UFW. What? Larry, was head of global organizing. He was the assistant director when the UFW was founded, and Cesar Chavez was the director. And so we never really hear about that story or even teach it to the next generation that we started a pivotal moment in American history and definitely in California state history. It changed. It changed so much. I mean, it was so significant globally, statewide, and nationwide when we talk about labor rights and specifically farm worker rights, because at the time, years prior to them starting the Great Delano Grape Strike, farm workers couldn't even start their own unions. And so all of this was all clandestine operations, really politically savvy Filipinos fighting for their rights from the 1920s on by the time we see them when the UFW starts. So it's not like Filipino community woke up and said, I'm going to fight for my rights in 1965. They had been striking and protesting since the 20s, since the 30s, since the 40s. So by the time we see our community, they are experienced, they are sophisticated, they are not just farm workers, but they definitely do not get credit at all when we talk about American history. And so it was really important to get the shine of New York City and all of these places. I'm coming from Stockton, from the Central Valley of California, which is mostly an agricultural community. So it's so important to have kind of our Filipino community with all the excellence in it. I mean, just right here speaking today, like all of the excellence here, we just needed to put a shine on that and say, hey, listen, we're part of American history.
Absolutely. And I love the metaphor of the farm labor movement as like this slow trickle. The Filipino community was really integral, a part of, and then breaking the door down and not entirely getting that credit. I think there's just something that is really moving about that, especially during this month. I do want to circle back to all of you because it has been, I think, a watershed year, especially for the AAPI community, given the rise of anti-Asian hate and the solidarity, I think, that we've seen as Asians and Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. So because you all have these really incredible projects, taking a look at that from the AAPI perspective, and starting with Gina, circling back to caretakers, I think about, like I said, the rise of anti-Asian hate and the sentiment that has just been thrown at the Asian community during this pandemic, and specifically the objectification of women, especially because we're talking about caretakers, healthcare workers that came from other countries like the Philippines to help the US in a time of dire need. Is there anything that you wanted to share on that front that was maybe uncovered during the documentary process?
It certainly has been, an overwhelming year on top of the pandemic that we were experiencing. I'd say specific for caretakers, I want to uplift this particular, which I think it's very much interlinked. We have an episode that's coming out in November that profiles Channing Centina, who's a Filipino and Black chef in New York City. And I'll tie it back because I think not just like notions of intersectionality, but it's really this very interconnected issues that we deal with and what it means to really center our story. So this particular episode is actually, he's a chef and he lost his job last year during COVID. But also when the George Floyd protests started happening, he started going to the protests. And because he's a chef, he started cooking Filipino food to the protesters, right? So that's one angle of like the Filipino-ness intersects with obviously with what's happening in the pandemic, intersects with, the uprising of Black Lives Matter protests. But also at the same time, we covered the historical context that you're mentioning, I think beyond the objectification of women, I think the root of this is really the humanization of anybody does not look like you, right? And I think as people, as the data that we know that Filipino nurses specifically are more likely to be on the front lines taking that risk. Even right, it's more than 30% of the death of the nurses that died during COVID are Filipinos, even though we only represent 4% of the nurses all over the United States. So there's that, right? And I think utilizing and using stories and unapologetically telling our story, also having Filipinos behind the camera, telling our own stories, showing these very complicated historical context, the migration narrative is one way to really unpack and uncover all of this.
And to that point, I want to circle back to Gail, because one of the silver linings of the AAPI movement that we've seen over the past few months and really the past year and a half of this pandemic has been a lot of the legislation in schools to include more history on Asian American contributions. So how do you see Larry the Musical fitting into that progress moving forward, and what it means for the next generation?
So when we talk about it's a wonderful thing when legislation and art come together, and they come together at the right time. So when our Attorney General, Rob Bonta, actually, when he was an assembly member, he wrote these two assembly bills, Assembly Bill 7, Assembly Bill 123. Assembly Bill 7 stated that if you were going to talk about, Larry, Assembly Bill 7 is for celebrating all public school students in the state of California celebrate Larry Itliong Day, which is on his birthday, October 25th. So if you have, if you have students who are in the public school system, they're supposed to celebrate Larry Itliong Day and his contributions to the state of California and to American history. And AB 123 states that, and these were passed, by the way, they were signed by then Governor Brown. They were states that if you talk about Cesar Chavez and the farm labor movement, you must talk about the Filipino American contributions. And so when they had passed those bills, there wasn't even a book about Larry Itliong. And so Dr. Dawn Mabalon and I called her up. I said, hey, listen, we need to do a children's book. There's not even a book about Larry. And so we worked on that. And unfortunately, she passed on the day that we submitted all of our work to the printers. And that was an absolute tragedy for our community. I can tell you guys, like counting by my hands, how many Filipino American historians who have PhDs in Filipino American history. That's how much we have here in the United States. There's not a lot. And when we lost Dawn, we lost one of our leading historians, and she was the first Pinay to graduate from Stanford with a PhD in history. And so in any case, when that art, the creation of this book, in addition to the illustrations that was created by Andre Sabayan, it came together perfectly with those assembly bills, and then also with ethnic studies. And so we're very much for that fight for ethnic studies and to teach the next generation about Asian American history and BIPOC contributions to the state of California, specifically here in California. But hopefully everyone knows whatever happens in California trickles down to the rest of the United States. So once that happens, we're hoping that ethnic studies for all continues, so that telling our story is normalized. And I love what Gina was saying, is that we're telling our stories and we're doing it our way. And that it's very important for us to tell it. And now that it is part of legislation, and our Governor Newsom now, ethnic studies for all, these stories should be coming out of our community now more regularly. It should be normalized, and other folks in the industry should know that we've been here, we've been blossoming, we've been growing this, and it's time.
I just want to continue what Gail was saying about us telling our own story. I cannot emphasize that enough, because I mean, as someone, as I mentioned earlier, was on the front of camera for so long and waiting for that job and always sitting on the casting and going to casting, waiting for that. I got tired of waiting. I got tired of waiting on the stories that I wanted to share, but also at the same time, what kind of stories that I wanted to share. I have no background in filmmaking. I have no background when I first started producing. So to people that are watching this, whether you are whatever you're thinking in your fields or whatever you are in your career, this is the time to tell that story in whatever form, right? Poem, you know, do videos, TikTok video, I don't know, it's anything else, right? I mean, like do conversations, do write a book, right? So many different things that it is our time right now. And there is, and just like what Gail said, there is so much to uncover. I mean, we did even with Caretex, we had 4 episodes. We wanted to do 10 episodes because we have 10 amazing, subjects. But obviously, COVID and Delta variant was happening. We were limited with what we could do. But to anyone that's listening, please, please tell your story. Start with your story. Write it down. Share it.
I love that, Gina.
Yeah, and storytelling is really the through line of all three of your projects. So I'm glad that you two really strongly touched on that. Joe, I want to come back to you because we know that representation within entertainment, especially with animated films, has been very limited for Asian stories and perspectives, including the Filipino community, the Filipino American community. Why do you think that is within that space? And what progress are you seeing moving forward? It made me so happy to hear that I believe your studio with Skydance welcomed your story and didn't try to change it.
Yeah. Um, ever since I got hired at Disney, I was like, oh my God, I'm gonna reveal my age now. Back on Pocahontas.
It's
Um,
okay.
it's
Cool
okay. Yeah,
yourself.
on Pocahontas, I was surprised to see how many Filipinos are there. Legends. Like really talented artists. I was like, why didn't I hear of this? People. They were like all high working behind the scenes and helping produce all these great films, right?
Kuya Ronnie Del
Um,
Carmen, right? I mean, like
yeah, yep. Ruben,
iconic.
yeah, Ruben Aquino is like the head animator of Ursula. Alex Nino, great illustrator, visual development
Say
artist,
it. Yes. There's so
master.
many.
Yeah, there's just so many. And all my years there, um, it they just kind of stayed behind the scenes, right? I mean, I remember being content in what I do and what I'm okay with this. This is like a dream job for me, and this is enough. You know, um, and then I moved into storyboarding. I was a 2D animator, and then transitioned to doing storyboards. And there's something I was fortunate to be like in a group where we kind of think about story and think about what the body of the story is going to be, and find those characters. And I remember talking about my personal experiences, and people appreciated it because it's like a completely different point of view. Um and usually when you try to build these characters, right, you find try to find mo- what people can relate to, and try to make them authentic. So we would share all our individual stories that are specific to us, but it kind of ends there, and then it gets kind of wrapped into this character. But my the specificity that I shared gets lost in that character. And now I think people like me are, I don't know, there's a wave that's happening where we're being given a chance to do a story specific to who we are. And I think there's an excitement that's building, and I can't help but infuse it with all of who I am, who I think just to take advantage of this opportunity, Um, yeah.
Yeah, and I think there's this archaic idea, right? And I don't know where it came from, But this idea that in order for something to be successful, audiences have to relate to it. And predominantly white audiences that have been a part of the blockbuster industry for a long time, or whatever industry we're talking about when it comes to entertainment, music. And I think of something even like Netflix right now. The number one movie in so many countries is Squid Game, with a relatively unknown cast for mainstream American audiences. And it is killing it in the numbers. And I think that's just a testament to the fact that if you have really strong storytelling and you have something that people can relate to, it can transcend language, it can transcend image. And I think we see that also, and hopefully we continue to see it with things like casting, to Gina's point. But also, I think for you, Joe, in your industry, it is so important because so much of what you create is seen by children in their formative years. Like I think back to Pocahontas, Aladdin, those were the Disney princesses that I gravitated toward because they were brown. They looked like me. So when you were creating Blush, did you have that in mind? Do you think about younger audiences?
Oh, totally, completely. I'm kind of like a kid still. I love cartoons. I love toys. Um, and I remember looking back, like remember Super Friends back in the late 70s or 80s. There's a character called his name's Apache Chief, and my first time seeing him, I thought he was Lapu Lapu, but no, he's a Native American um, who's hanging out with Batman and Superman. So, but I was like, for me, he's Lapu Lapu, you know, because he looks exactly like him. And I remember the impact that it had on me, and like, just that small amount of representation, even just the look, even knowing after knowing that he's not really Filipino, it's just the look. And and surprisingly too, it's like just the mango is getting so much I'm getting a lot of like
I was
positive.
gonna say that. I was gonna say that too. I can't wait to just tell you. I mean, like seeing the way that mango is eaten was like, what did that? My mama used to put that on rice, and but also the way to peel it is exactly like that.
Right.
Putting mango with white rice and tuyo. Oh my god, it
Oh
was.
my god.
I
Yeah, I
saw
was asked like how often do you eat mango growing up? I was like, it's always, after every meal we eat mango,
yes,
It's
yes.
like and yeah, that the way you know, a lot of my coworkers were surprised. Oh, you can peel a mango like that? Yeah, that's how my grandma used to do it. Um and then yeah, of course the hedgehog, I guess, yeah, I found out there's a name for it. It's hedgehog, where you kind of like cross slice it and open it up.
Yep.
I just found that out today. I knew what the cut was. I never heard it being referred to as like the hedgehog.
Yeah. And you know what? When we were like building the mango and I was like issuing it, I gave them tons of references. I wanted to be like specifically Manila mango,
Yes.
Carabao mango, our national fruit. And yeah, and it's just creating, even just a small food like that, it creates so much excitement because of our hunger for representation, right? So
And that specificity that you mentioned. I mean, like even just mango. I mean, like in the Philippines, we have an island specifically that just grows mango. Guimaras, right?
yeah.
It's an island next to Iloilo, and I've been there, and it's like there's so many mangoes, and we were there on vacation. We were like, when is the fiesta for mango here? And we just unfortunately we just missed it. But
Yeah.
it's that kind of cultural references, and I mean, it's just so powerful. Hey, I mean, let me also just say, as someone you know who's been in so many rooms where I'm the only one, the only trans person in the room amongst straight cisgender people, the only immigrant in the room, the only first time director, or I think they call it multi hyphenate now these days. There's power in seeing and connecting with a very specific thing, because that's that rule. The more specific you go, the more
Mhm.
truthful that you go in that story, the more universal it becomes,
Yeah.
right? And I
Yeah.
think because of that
Yeah.
myth that you mentioned, Asia, that it's that myth that we've been told, and it's not. And because of so many platforms that are opening now, It
Yeah.
is time to tell that story. My mom would always tell me, what kind of projects are you doing now? Because certainly my mom wanted me to be a nurse, obviously, and I love
Yes,
her for that.
mine too, a doctor.
But I think she've accepted that because I'm the baby, so she's now accepted that I'm doing creative stuff. So and she supports it.
Yeah, I should say my mom was 100% supportive, wanted me to be in TV and broadcast journalism. It was my grandma that was like, I want you to be a doctor or a lawyer. So my mom would kill me if she heard this and said that, oh, you said I wanted you to be a doctor. But yeah, Gina, to your point, I think the specificity is so important because it's like just how this is a love letter to Joe's family and the grief that he was able to turn into something really beautiful. Those moments when you're really specific with the details are a love letter to our community, to Asian communities, to underrepresented voices. And you'll find that audiences are smart. They can relate and they can see past that. And it also helps with the objectification that we're talking about with women and people in general. You don't see someone as a box to tick off on a census or as a race. You see them as a fellow human being. And I think that at the end of the day is the goal. I do want to talk with Gina. I'm going to come back to Gail, but Gina, because you mentioned being one of the only people in the room who looks like you have throughout your career really been a trailblazer, not only for Filipinx women, trans women, immigrants, individuals who are trying to make their mark in your space, and just to, shine a light on what an image of beauty can be. You've done so much, and I'm sure that you've seen a lot in terms of progress within the LGBTQ space, in the minority representation space. But what else do you want to see in terms of progress, despite all of that? Because we know just because one person makes it doesn't mean that we are making real felt progress across the board and also behind the scenes.
It's important that you're saying this. I mean, as I mentioned, I think a big catalyst for me jumping into producing was that I would be in a power room, lead, mostly older white men making decisions about the lives of trans people, funding, and all that. I just remember being the only one and expected to first carry the burden of over explaining to them and making sure that like this is the kind of money for funding for a specific group. First of all, it was a lot into reliving their trauma, right? And the second thing, I began to question, how do I keep this door open? And for me, at that time in my career, in my life, I was so ready to tell the story because as I mentioned, I was born and raised in the Philippines. I've lived half of my life in the Philippines, half here. So I know I carry this very global perspective, a very complicated perspective to bring about, the culture and, how I was brought up in the Philippines to growing up here and continuing my life here in the United States. And I carry that with me in all the projects that I create, that kind of perspective. And yes, things are opening up and I'm writing my book. I am, producing other projects, like I want to just create a media empire in some sense because there's so many stories that and in so many different ways to tell that story. But also at the same time, alluding to what you said about people behind the scenes, I think my dream is to really create that pipeline to have more showrunners and decision makers that greenlit projects in big studios and big platforms, that people that look like us. When we're coming to that room, we don't need to over explain what we're doing, right? The people that get it right away. Because I think as people of color and the history, even growing up in the Philippines, the history of colonization, imperialism, there's a lot to unburden us to over explain that. So when you have someone that gets that right away, and then we get to really flourish in all these complicated stories that we needed to share.
And one person who's making a tremendous impact when it comes to this is Gail, because you founded Bridge and Delta Publishing. Your publishing house has the goal of elevating immigrant stories. Why is this important to you, and how does the publishing house do this?
The publishing house was really so that we could tell our story without having a publisher or another editor uh, make it shorter or make it more marketable. When Don and I did the Larry Itliong book, we knew no one would want it. No one had wanted it for years and years and years. And so I thought, well, I have to make my own publishing house to do this. And so we're doing, um, a, you know, children's books about our Filipino American greats, right? That who have created impact in the United States and within our community, because no one else would tell our story. And I think just because the technology is on our side now, and the fact that we have so many teachers and we have a wonderful pipeline in San Francisco called Pinoy Educational Partnerships that actually trains all of our teachers, and they go throughout the state and they are experts at ethnic studies, so that we could give them these books and we can get them as part of the California Department of Education curriculum, so that we can actually become institutionalized within school districts, within the state. And as we start marching California policies throughout the country, we are part and embedded in being institutionalized, our voices and our stories and our historical importance. And so, but here's the thing, we had to do it ourselves. No one else would want this. I won't say who I had spoken to, but I was in a room trying to get another big publisher to look at A Journey for Justice about Larry Itliong, and it was too long. The book's too long. And the book's too long. It talks too much about politics. It talks too much about the migration of Filipino Americans. It talks too much about these things that maybe children are not ready for. But our people are ready for this. Our young ones are ready for this, and so we have to start at a really young age. We have to really be there and really understand, like, our stories need to be institutionalized. Our books need to be part of reading lists. Our series need to be part of must-watch lists. We must integrate them within classrooms. We must integrate them in universities. We must integrate them wherever we are. And for me to do that, we had to also get the trust of the community and the backing, because we knew, I do this for my living room, and whatever my family can contribute, we do, but we need our community to help us come together financially to tell these stories, if you want us to keep on telling these stories, because a big funder is not going to fund any of this, at least in the past. Maybe they will now, but the way that we want to tell it and the way we want to be so very specific about it and very culturally specific about it, this is how we want to do it. And the only way that we have control to that, and the only way that we can have it accessible to those communities that may not have access to finances, or maybe not even access to internet, or maybe they don't have access to teachers or professional development for those teachers to even teach our stories. We had to find a way to go from the ground up. You have a curriculum that's free. So we have a curriculum for Journey for Justice that all teachers can just download on the website of the publishing house. We're going to do that for all the books that we're doing. We're training teachers to do that. We do curriculum lesson plans. So this is free. So if you're a caregiver, if you are, your, parents or grandparents or cousins or aunties or are there, they can have this also. And so it's really interwoven to really give everybody the tools to talk about us, and for us to be at the center of the story, but truly institutionalizing. And I do feel like with the publishing house, it has been a learning experience. I've worked within publishing, but it's always a new animal when you talk about funding. And so I think that has been the way to really, especially also with the musical is definitely community funded, and also thankfully funded by other city parts of San Francisco City. They donated to, or they granted us for Larry the Musical, so we were able to put that out. The theater community was able to give us some grants, but but mostly it really is our community, and it's our artists out of pocket who want to have control of the narrative and are not willing to have it generalized.
If, you know what, let me also just say, if Gail is not going to say, I'm going to say it, since we're in this space, there is a crowdfunding for Larry the Musical.
Thank
We're
you,
in this
Gina.
space. Please check it out. Follow Gail. It's available, and you know we need to support each other. And certainly, that's one project that I will be supporting in so many ways.
I
Thank
love that
you.
support. And I think that that is another really good point, oftentimes, especially because it is Filipino American History Month. Our community wants to celebrate this month. What better way than to support the community? And not even through money. Yes, money is great. We know times are tough. It's a pandemic, everyone's experiencing it differently. But I always say the best way to vote is with your attention. When you see these projects come up on social media, share them, share the crowdfunding project, share Blush when you watch it on Apple TV Plus, share Caretakers when you see it, and rave about it and really give these things your attention because it makes a difference. And it also changes the funding when it comes to decisions that are made maybe from gatekeepers that don't understand the context or don't understand the audience yet because we don't have the research there. If they see that we come out for Shang-Chi and that translates to dollars, they think twice when they're greenlighting a new project that maybe would have faced challenges before. So it really makes a difference where you put your attention and where you put your support in terms of finances as well.
Yeah.
I do want to switch gears though. I know we don't have a ton of time left with you guys, but in the spirit of this month, I wanted to go around the room and just talk about your relationship with your Filipino heritage. I think you all have different, very different experiences. So let's start with Joe.
Oh, yeah. You know, like for me, I think really like the family orientation, right? Like and that's I'm very big with that, especially with what I've been through, you know, after the loss that um I've experienced. Just looking to family and, you know, um um for support and um during COVID too. Like I miss everyone and I can't wait for us to have those big reunions that, you know, we always do, you know. But yeah, just yeah, that's very important for me, you know.
Gail, how about you? How would you describe your relationship to your Filipino heritage?
I think I'm straddling two sides. I'm an immigrant, so I was born in Manila and I came here, but all of my mom's side of the family, all of the men had been here since the 20s and 30s. And so I grew up with a family that had no accents and were really already just really tough and hardened farm workers, right? They didn't give a blank about what they said, about who was in the room. They let you know what they needed. They were very straightforward and very direct and a very non-Filipino. They were very Western communication skills versus what I would normally see within my family that's culturally brought up in the Philippines. And so I feel like I'm kind of in the middle of all that. And so I grew up with very, very American um, family, whereas in our home we only spoke to Tagalog. My parents did not speak English to us. They only spoke Tagalog. My mom's Ilocano, my dad's Tagalog. We grew up growing our own vegetables and eating them, and just really raised with a very Filipino upbringing, but surrounded by these Americans who just happened to be Filipino, who had lived longer in the United States than here. And it's you see like a 60, 70-year-old man who's like speaking like, English and like raw, like English, like cussing, like, the farm workers were tough, man. And so grew up with that kind of toughness and that tenacity. And in a very Filipino American perspective, but had parents who were very much raised in the Philippines. And so I think it's really absolutely woven. I mean, just being an immigrant and my language is Tagalog, my first language. I mean, you just can't. When you dream in Tagalog, when you speak in Tagalog, when you translate in Tagalog, it's so much deeper. Right? Like in Tagalog, you can say brown in so many different ways, but it's subjective depending on how you feel, right? As a writer, you're like, well, what do I use? Is it kayumangi, kape? You know what I mean? But when you speak in English, there's only like one brown. And so there's also like a depth of language there and an understanding of like the Philippines is so mystical and it's so deep and it has so much spirituality in a way that is not covered in Western culture. And but to have that perspective, I feel like I'm wrapped up in all of that. And I think it's a beautiful way to see, but to have all of that mysticism, to have all of that emotion, like Philip, like just looking at the language alone, like it's really deep. It's so deep, like how you can translate anything depending on how you feel.
Well, since we're in the subject of language, Gail, I think for me, it's the thing that you're saying about language. For me, it's really the queering of Filipino language. There's so many languages that we have. I mean, in Tagalog, in majority of our language, we don't even have he or she.
Yeah.
We're a gender neutral language. So I'm always uplifting that because I came from a very vibrant trans community in the Philippines. I grew up from the transgender beauty pageants growing up. That's been part of long history, right? So also the understanding of pre-colonial gender fluidity that is so vibrant, that is very innate in our culture, the babaylans, the asog, it's very much ingrained. So for me, that my relationship is always queering the language and always uplifting that very long pre-colonial history. With that comes with I'm always in the process of decolonizing my mind, decolonizing my understanding and how I was brought up. Because I mean, I'm saying this because it's both fortunately or unfortunately, a lot of my pre-colonial understanding did not happen in the Philippines. A lot of those unpacking of those texts because I, also growing up without any access to these informations readily available, I didn't learn about, babaylan in the Philippines. I didn't learn about this gender neutral language. I unfortunately I had to leave the motherland in order to truly understand the big complexity of the motherland and its long history from colonization to imperialism, right? But I'm also just like, when I go travel with my family, I still sleep. We still sleep like a lupiang Shanghai, like next to each other on a hotel room. Like that's the kind of connection with my family that I still have. That just alluding to that language that you mentioned, Gail, it's very much centered to my spirituality and my work.
And I'm really honored to hear all of your stories immigrating to the US because I was born in Southern California and raised here. I grew up third generation with parents who don't speak Tagalog and can understand a little bit. But I think for a lot of our audience, maybe for third generation or even other generations of Filipino Americans, you kind of straddle the line and think you're not quite American enough because you don't look American and whatever that means. And you don't feel quite Filipino enough because you don't have that shared experience through language. So it's been interesting to use these moments to really educate myself about where I'm from and where my roots are. And I think that speaks to a completely different experience. Our culture and our community is certainly not a monolith. So I just wanted to share that as well. But I appreciate you all sharing your experiences because you have incredible stories. I wish I had 3 hours with you so we could talk more about them. But I think my last question that I wanted to go around to all of you is because you have this experience as immigrants, what was it about America that made you want to come here, that made you want to become an American and pursue this dream? Starting with Gail.
I came because my father wanted us to be there. My mom actually did not want to leave at all. In fact, she went back to the Philippines. We waited for her to come get us, but when she came back, to she wanted to stay and she was not taking my father's phone calls. She was like, "You're going to take me to the farmland and I have Manila. You're joking." And right in the middle of nowhere, we're surrounded by fields and fields, right? Um, but, you know, what made me want to flourish here, I think, is the racism, to be honest. Um, Growing up with racism, especially in an ag community, and seeing, people asking, "Oh, are you Mexican? Oh, you're Filipino. That means you're a good worker." People not really knowing, who I was, like, ethnicity wise. Um, and just, like my sister would get spit on and be called a stupid Chinese at school. I mean, that racism, that anger, like, builds up in you. And so I think that, and then being surrounded by Filipinos who had had to deal with that for decades here in the United States, it made me want to not necessarily be so American, but really be upfront and center with my Filipino ness. And I live in the United States. I am here. I'm an American now. But I too am very, very Filipino. And you cannot take the Filipino American out of me, no matter how racist you are towards me and my family.
I love that. And Joe, how about you?
Yeah, well, I followed Marianne basically. Marianne, I was the last one in our immediate family to come here, and I was already like working in the Philippines. And Marianne got petitioned to move here. So, and I, for me to explain why I had to do that, it's just I was gifted in the short. You guys have seen it, right? Or I can explain it. Like there's a mango plant in the dome that the astronaut uh, plants, and he's very like that's his favorite plant, and he's very hopeful that it'll grow, right? But no, it just withers and die. In the short, it's used to foreshadow his fate, basically. That's him. He's got a limited supply of air, but that mango plant represents my the gift that I knew I had ever since I was a kid is that I could draw. You just give me a pen and paper and I can sit in the corner for hours. And I knew I had that, but I didn't know what I wanted to do with it, or where I can take it. It's not until I met Marianne in college um, that she basically helped me nurture it, because of our shared passion in art and animation specifically, you know. And I remember her talking about dreaming about, yeah, coming here in the States and working at Disney. For me, I was like, oh, that's impossible. I remember telling that to Marianne. That's like too big of a dream to like even think about. Um, but yeah, she got hired, and she's actually the one who told me about an opening at Disney. That's why I got hired at Pocahontas. She got hired at Disney first. But going back to just the importance of Marianne and why the movie is titled Blush is because our first week in college, Marianne, I heard this laughter coming from across the room, and I went over there to check it out, and it's coming from this. I think she's the tiniest person in her class, and as soon as she turned around, I introduced myself. She turned red, like a little concerning. It was too red. I thought she was into me, but for me, it was love at
What?
first
What?
sight. No, she wasn't. I found out she was just her nickname in high school was Ketchup, Gina. You know, yeah, she's known for like just
Wow.
blushing, when she gets embarrassed or shy. Um, so yeah, and I think Marianne made me want to be a better person and really, really, pursue the potential of this gift that was given to me. And even now, with her gone, I'm like, look at me. I'm here talking about, I'm not. This is like, you know, I'm I'm a very shy guy, and I feel like Marianne's still encouraging me to do things that I didn't think I could do, in telling of our story, and yeah, this is what this place means to me. It's a realization of a dream.
Mm.
And what a gorgeous legacy to leave behind, a blush that inspires someone to really pursue their dream and even do it in a completely different country. I think that is so beautiful. Gina, how about you? Bring us home.
All
Tell us why
right.
you wanted to pursue the American dream.
Whatever that means, right? I
Yeah.
think, well, I mean, I was, born and raised in the Philippines. The thing, the one I could say is it's better opportunity as a trans Filipina. I mean, unfortunately, in the Philippines, in as much as we have this very vibrant trans beauty pageant that is so mainstream in the Philippines, it is not politically recognized as a trans woman. So moving here in the United States, where I'm seen as the woman that I am legally, was a big deal, a dream come true that was still to this day is not possible in the Philippines. However, because of that, the culture at the time when I moved to San Francisco in 2001 to be with my mom, to be with my family. By the time, even we're just beginning in the cusp of this conversation about transgender, issues or transgender lives, the culture, was not ready to have a trans person in any mainstream culture, so it presented this very complicated life for me. Yes, in the Philippines, I was out and proud at 15 years old, joining pageants, but then I'm not politically recognized on my legal documents. But then when I moved to the US, I was politically recognized, but there is no trans beauty pageant on national television the way that we have it in the Philippines. So it's complicated. But then because of that, and moving to New York City, pursuing my career as a model, I had to go back to the closet. I had to internalize that shame again, and then I had to come out again. So it's been quite a journey, but here I am now doing all of these projects because of that journey. I'm in some way I had to go through that journey in order to really have this perspective, and with the projects with caretakers, in presenting that kind of community and subject matters that I am personally familiar with, that's the kind of thing I want to continue doing. And I think all of that, all of those things that I've shared about my journey really influences, the projects and the vision and the crazy ideas that I have. So
And I am so looking forward to all of the incredible work that you are all doing currently and that is to come. Thank you so much for taking the time for this conversation. I think it's really powerful and affirming for our community and all of the Filipinx individuals, Asian Americans, and even just individuals who feel underrepresented right now, to hear from you and the different things that you're working on and how you're moving the needle. I wanted to really quickly thank Facebook and, of course, Gold House for putting this panel together. And I hope that everyone stays safe and healthy.
salamat.
Thank you.
Salamat,
Salamat.
Pascal.
Salamat.
Happy Filipino American History Month.